I want to start with the special counsel's investigation into January 6th because there was some news this week. The New York Times is reporting that prosecutors have questioned multiple witnesses in recent weeks, including Jared Kushner. What does that indicate to you about where they are in the investigation and what charges it may bring?
It seems like they're zeroing in on the question of what exactly Donald Trump knew and what he believed. There were a lot of indications we got during the January 6th hearings that he knew he had lost the election. And if they can nail that down with some witnesses, that will solidify his culpable intent.
Yeah, Jared Kushner said he didn't know he lost, it seems, in the reporting, which seems to me, that sounds like you're a little skeptical of that.
Well, Cassidy Hutchinson told us that he said, "Can you believe I lost to this guy?" So when he was behind the scenes, it was perfectly clear. There are also a series of administrative steps that he took for the government, indicating that he knew that there was going to be a succession of power. And he knew it was really over, while he was saying on the other side to the mob, we're going to stop this and, we're going to reclaim it and so on.
What unanswered questions do you have from the investigation, given how deeply you were embedded in this for Special Counsel Jack Smith, that you hope he will answer?
There are a number of formal parts of the investigation that I wish we had had more time and more resources to go after. For example, we knew that the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers were acting as the frontline shock troops to attack the officers and to try to unleash the wrath of the mob against anybody who was protecting us and to storm the Capitol. We know that they were acting in a very organized fashion, but we didn't have all of the specific conversations and communications that took place. And obviously, they tried to guard them
between the Oath Keepers and
the people at the top.
Now, the Department of Justice, it's been reported that they had a strategy of waiting on launching a more aggressive investigation into Donald Trump himself because they wanted to focus on the Oath Keepers and others around him.
That's right.
That has, by all accounts, delayed the process, meaning that it could go post-election. How concerned are you about that, and how do you feel about their strategy to focus on the Oath Keepers first?
Well, it seems to me that they've proceeded the way that prosecutors like to proceed in an organized crime investigation. You start with the smallest fish, and then you work your way up. You get them to flip or to testify as to the people who are above them until you get to the very top. And that's how a lot of the Godfather prosecutions work. And it seems like they were following that principle. I mean, the difference here, of course, is that so much of Donald Trump's incitement and coordination of these events took place in plain view.
Donald Trump is also calling for an indefinite delay before he goes to trial. His lawyers are, I should say, in the classified documents case. And Special Counsel Jack Smith's prosecutors argued strongly against any delay. Is there any valid argument for a delay?
I don't think that there should be any delay in an existing prosecution. Otherwise, any criminal defendant in the country would declare for president or Senate or House or mayor and say, you can't prosecute me anymore. You got to wait till next year or the year after. Think of it this way. If somebody is running for office and then is implicated in a murder or a rape or an armed robbery, would we say, no, we're going to hold that until after the election, if in the normal course of events it would take place before? He should be treated exactly the way anybody else would be treated in the same situation. There have been hundreds of prosecutions of people on the basis of crimes that took place on January 6th. Why should he be special?
There is some reporting that some of Trump's advisors have been blunt in private conversations, that he is looking to win the election to protect himself by issuing a self-pardon.
Yeah.
How concerned are you about the precedent, about the legality, about every aspect of it?
As with so many things relating to Donald Trump, it's what we call a case of first impression. Nobody knows because nobody's ever pushed the limits like this before. No president has ever been in a situation where he's had to think about pardoning himself, much less essentially promising to pardon himself. But James Madison said in the Federalist Papers that the cardinal principle of justice in our system is that no man may be a judge in his own cause, in his own case. And so it does seem to cut against that very basic principle. Again, he pushes our legal system to the extreme, and we are forced to judge these very radical concepts that have never been tested before. But I think there's at least as good an argument that the president cannot pardon himself as the idea that he can.
Do you think that's what he's up to?
Well, I certainly believe that he's trying to use his candidacy and his campaign as a shield against legal prosecution.
Given Trump hasn't been held accountable yet, it's in process in some ways, and he clearly hasn't changed his behavior much. What concerns you the most about what he could do to subvert the next election?
Well, a lot of it we're seeing in plain sight right now. There are efforts to change election laws all over the country where Trump-loyal Republican Party legislative leaders are trying to engage in voter suppression tactics, other efforts to undermine the ability to get a fair count in the election. We saw what they tried to do with the independent state legislature doctrine, which so far has not worked on the Supreme Court. The idea that the state legislatures essentially can do whatever they want with respect to elections.
I want to ask you about the work of the Oversight Committee, because you and Congressman Dan Goldman sent a letter to Oversight Chair James Comer this week requesting that he hand over any information he's received from Gal Luft, the man who the GOP claimed, in case people haven't been following this in detail, had evidence of corruption by the Biden family and who was charged with arms trafficking, sanctions violations, and acting as an unregistered agent for China. It's almost like a part of a movie that is happening right now, according to an indictment unsealed this week. What questions, what information are you seeking about James Comer's involvement with Luft, and what do you really want to know?
Well, look, Gal Luft was supposed to be the star witness in arraigning Joe Biden on the old Giuliani charges of a fake Ukrainian bribery scandal. And it turns out that Luft was missing, as Chairman Comer kept saying. The reason he was missing is because he's a fugitive from justice. He's on the run around the world away from the U.S. government. And this was going to be the star witness against Joe Biden. And what I'm afraid has happened, Jen, is that the Trump party has created such a topsy-turvy world that we're getting real low-life characters like George Santos, like Donald Trump, like Gal Luft, who say, I think I'm going to be able to launder all of my crimes and wrap myself in the protection of the Republican Party. They see targets
of people they could go after to help them.
That's right.
And so how concerned are you that James Comer was the chairman of the committee, was knowingly, unknowingly working with, co-opted by a foreign agent? I'm
just concerned that the House Oversight Committee, which has a very proud history with Congressman Waxman as chair, the great Elijah Cummings of Maryland as chair, is suddenly being compromised in a really serious way. Our legitimacy is being eroded by the tactics adopted by Chairman Comer. They essentially have said, we will validate anybody who will say anything about the Bidens. And of course, they haven't laid a glove on President Biden. There are real issues that are confronting our people, and they're off on this wild goose chase related to Hunter Biden and Joe Biden, and their main witnesses are people who are fleeing justice in America.
I wanted to quickly ask you about Fox News, because there was a defamation lawsuit filed by Ray Epps against Fox News after the network and former host Tucker Carlson repeatedly claimed Epps was an undercover FBI agent who helped provoke the insurrection at the Capitol. As a constitutional lawyer and expert, somebody who knows this case deeply, how strong do you think Epps's defamation case is?
Well, I think it's a very strong case. In the United States of America, which has the First Amendment, it's very hard to prove defamation against someone. Very hard. You've got to prove that they intentionally lied or were so reckless about the truth that they ended up essentially disparaging your character in a damaging way. And even with that very strict, narrow standard, the Dominion Company was able to win a settlement out of court with Fox News. So he saw how Dominion beat Fox News, and he decided, I'm going to do the same thing. They have basically libeled him, they've slandered him, they have defamed him by saying that he would lie about who he was when he was one of their supporters. He's on their side. And that's one of the things that never ceases to amaze me, the way that they turn on their own supporters and devour them. I hope that he's not just in it to defeat them legally, but he's in it to arrive at a political epiphany about what kind of authoritarian movement he associated with. That is the pathway to redemption for America. When people begin to recognize that they were acting like members of a religious cult. Unfortunately, there's still millions of people doing that, and a lot of them are in Congress right now.